following program is brought to you by your friends at Podcast One.
All right, boys and girls, we are back with another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm your host, Ben Domenech. You can email us, as always, at radio@thefederalist.com and follow us on Twitter at FDRLST. We are brought to you by Podcast One, and we're coming to you from Hillsdale College's Kirby Center in Washington, D.C., where my guest for the hour today is author, academic, senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Niall Ferguson is with us today. You can follow him on Twitter at nfergus. His latest book is The Square and the Tower, Networks and Power from the Freemasons to Facebook. Sir, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today.
Pleasure to be with you.
So I want to begin by asking you a little bit about your latest book. The Square and the Tower is a fascinating look into the networks that make up sort of the most powerful social institutions of our time, but also have an impact on our political and economic institutions as well. What was it that made you decide to write this book?
Good question. I had been thinking a lot about networks over my career. I've written about financial networks in the case of the Rothschild Bank and even George Soros's hedge fund network. I'd written about imperial networks in a book called Empire, which showed how networks of emigrants had in many ways built the British Empire. But I'd never really sat down and formalized my understanding of networks, and it was writing The Life of Henry Kissinger that forced me to do it. I am in fact halfway through a large biography of Kissinger, and I wanted the second half of the life to focus on his extraordinary network. And just as I was getting into that, I started to realize that I needed to be a bit more precise about what I meant by network, and that led me into some very fascinating reading on the subject of network science. I guess it also helped that I moved to Stanford from Harvard, because when you get to Stanford, you're right next to Silicon Valley, and everybody talks about social networks the whole time. And I was slightly shocked to discover, perhaps I shouldn't have been, but I was, that people in Silicon Valley don't really care about history, or at least they think history began with the Google IPO. And so when I started talking about historic social networks, I got a lot of blank looks. So I wrote the book partly to give Silicon Valley a history lesson.
Yes, of course. If you can't find it on YouTube, then it does not exist.
Exactly.
So you delve into this from a lot of different perspectives, but since you brought up Silicon Valley, you write in the chapter about that actually, one of the interesting parts about this is that the interconnected world that's been created in a lot of these ways has a structure that is actually very inegalitarian. It's the opposite of kind of the way that Facebook and other organizations present themselves to the world. Tell us a little bit about why that is, in the sense that the structure underneath these existing forms is often at odds with the principles that they publicly advocate for.
Right. Well, Silicon Valley's been selling some pretty agreeable Kool-Aid for the past 20 years, and the label on the Kool-Aid bottle says, "Thanks to the internet, we are all netizens, all equally connected and equally empowered to speak truth to power." And therefore, these wonderful network platforms that we're building on the internet, such as Facebook and Twitter, are very helpful to democracy. This story, I think, lasted a lot longer than it should have, because in reality, there's nothing terribly democratic about the way social networks operate. I'll give you two specific examples. From network science, we know that social networks are not like lattices in which each node, each individual person has the same number of connections to other people, the same number of edges, to use the network jargon. In reality, social networks are characterized by an almost scale-free structure where some nodes have crazily large numbers of relationships, of edges, and many have hardly any. And so there's a kind of inherently inegalitarian quality to large social networks, which is visible if you just look at the number of followers that you and I have on Facebook or Twitter and the number that Donald Trump has, or really any super celebrity figure. So I think that's the first point that often gets overlooked. A networked world is not a flat world. It's actually a very hierarchical world in which a few people are super connected and most people really aren't. The other striking feature of the networked economy is that a relatively small number of companies establish near monopoly positions in their particular market niche. Amazon in the case of e-commerce, Google in the case of search, and Facebook in social networks. And the people who established those companies and the early investors in those companies own a huge chunk of the, if you like, the architecture of our public sphere today. The rest of us, unless we were smart enough to buy the stock at some point, are basically just users. And users are different from consumers. It's probably wrong to think of network platforms having users who are consumers. Actually, what they have are users who give their data free to the network platforms, who then are able to make money by making that data accessible indirectly to advertisers. That's the business model, and I think that is the most striking feature of the economics of networks. There's been a winner-takes-all quality to the way that Silicon Valley has evolved. And if you were there, if you were present at the creation or early on in the creation of what became a monopoly, you are a billionaire. And why would you give up that position? It seems highly unlikely that Mark Zuckerberg, for example, is going to distribute the equity in Facebook to users.
You know, one of the things that you mentioned there that I find so striking is that the Zuckerbergian thesis about the world, as much as he had one early on, goes something like this. If only people are more exposed to other cultures and other people and people from different places and people who aren't like them, then they will become more interested, more empathetic, more of a global citizen, more high-minded about all these different things. He had this idea that if we're exposed to people who aren't like us, that we'll like them and have this human connection with them. It turns out, after many years of experience, that as many people realize, the opposite is the case, and that we would much rather argue with strangers on the internet than empathize for them in their own private struggle. What do you think, having sort of enough perspective now to see the impact that social media in particular has had on the way that people live and relate across culture, do you think that this is having ultimately a negative effect on the public square or a positive one?
Well, certainly Mark Zuckerberg and others, he wasn't alone in this, told us that by connecting ever larger numbers of people, we could build a global community, and we'd then get together and solve all the great problems facing mankind, from climate change to poverty. That's not quite how it's turned out. Mm-hmm. And I think that was predictable, because both history and network science predicted that large online social networks would tend to become polarized. There's a term for this, homophily, or to use an old saying, birds of a feather flock together. And online, this is obvious in Facebook and in Twitter and other places, people tend to congregate into liberal clusters and conservative clusters. And when you look at the way in which politics is discussed online, it's really striking how little traffic there is between these two clusters, and also how far these clusters have become hotbeds for not just fake news but extreme views. I think history predicted that too, because when you created large social networks using the printing press, if you go back to the 1500s, when the printing press really spreads rapidly throughout Europe and becomes a transmission mechanism for ideas of religious reformation, contrary to Martin Luther's expectations, European society doesn't morph into a priesthood of all believers with everybody reading the Bible and having a direct relationship to God and being godly. What actually happens is a bitter 100-year-plus civil war between those who embrace the Reformation, Protestants, and those who oppose it in a counter-Reformation. So I think that when they were predicting the happy, clappy global community, Mark Zuckerberg and others underestimated the probability that there would in fact be this kind of polarization, and that the more they saw of liberal culture, the more conservatives would react viscerally against it, and vice versa.
Mm-hmm. You know, digital life and the networks that we inhabit are certainly a threat to a lot of different things, but it seems, you know, in terms of the experience lately here in America, it's been a significant threat to free speech within the public square. It's obviously also, of course, a threat given the use of technology by candidates such as Donald Trump, as you've pointed out yourself, that it represents a threat to established elites. Do you think that both of these dangers are sort of running concurrently, or do you think that there's one that is going to be more likely to crumble first?
Well, I don't think it's a danger if the internet allows people who've been politically marginalized to challenge political elites have become entrenched. And part of what was healthy about the events of 2016 was that provincial England, in the case of the Brexit referendum, and middle America, in the case of the presidential election, were empowered to challenge liberal leaning establishments in the big cities that had completely lost touch with people in the so-called heartland. And I think that's something that one should recognize as healthy, even if one was a member of the metropolitan elite. I guess I was on Brexit because I was opposed to it. But you know, the more time I spent in provincial England and Wales listening to what people were saying, the better I began to understand their motivations. And the same applied in the US. If you sat on the Harvard campus or the Stanford campus, you had absolutely no idea what was motivating Trump supporters. If you went to Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, or Michigan, then you got it. So I don't worry too much about that. In fact, if anything, I think it's healthy. But I think your first point is the really troubling one, that the way that the social networks work online is not necessarily conducive to the free exchange of ideas. And I'm not just talking here about the ways in which fake news can go viral on social networks online. I'm also talking about the ways in which the kind of the mob of ferocious tweeters or bloggers can vilify people for taking views that the mob disapproves of, and the kind of vicious quality of the public sphere online. You'll know this if you're involved in Twitter, can be deeply off-putting to people who just don't want to be on the receiving end of a cascade of expletive-filled tweets and character assassination. I mean, that's one big worry. I mean, related, but perhaps even more important, is the prospect that the people who control the network platforms, that is to say, the people who run Facebook and Twitter and the rest, have the power to exclude from the public sphere, from their network platforms, anybody that they don't like, anybody who doesn't meet their, quote, community standards, unquote. Now, that's a very vague term, but the possibility clearly exists, and it became very apparent after the Charlottesville events, that internet service providers and the network platforms themselves have the power to exclude or filter out anybody that they decide is beyond the pale. And after Charlottesville, it was white supremacists, neo-Nazis. Nobody has any sympathy for them. And so there wasn't anything but applause when people like that were being kicked off the internet. But, you know, it's a legitimate question to ask. Who decides who gets kicked off the internet? And if the answer is the Facebook algorithm, that means that Facebook decides. Yes. And that can't be healthy for a society which is predicated on free speech.
So in reading this book, it has something different going on in it than a number of your other books that I've read, which is that interspersed throughout it are these various network graphs of all these different lines interconnecting various little pockets and things. And so the two things that kept cropping up in my mind as I was reading it are both the It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia meme that I'm sure you've seen if you're on Twitter of Charlie Day, his the bearded actor pointing at a wall where he has all these interconnected lines because he can't figure out where the mail is supposed to go, and the other being the Simpsons Stonecutters song, which if you're not familiar with it, is sort of a pseudo Freemason organization that Homer Simpson belongs to very briefly, in which they have a song where they say who holds back the electric car, who makes Steve Gutenberg a star? We do. In other words, that they are behind everything. As you sort of went through and were digging up all these different graphs and networks, were you sort of stunned at the number of them that you could find that existed throughout history at all these different levels? It just seems like there are a lot more of them than I might have imagined prior to reading your book.
Right. I certainly found as I was writing the book that one network seemed to lead to another, and I'd keep thinking, even in the later stages of writing it, of things that I really couldn't leave out. The mafia is a good example. I realized late in the writing of the book that I couldn't have a book about social networks that excluded crime networks. And so I frantically delved into the literature on the mafia so that I could say something about how that particular secret society operated. And it applies to each period. I was writing about some Masonic lodges in the 18th century when I suddenly came upon a wonderful bunch of recent literature on the Illuminati. Now, the Illuminati are the kind of social network that conspiracy theorists never tire of writing about. It was exciting to find that there was some serious literature on the Illuminati, and one could actually write their history, and indeed that's how I begin the book. And so on I would go, thinking of new social networks that it would be fun to add. The Apostles, the most exclusive intellectual network in British history, which just happened to get hacked by the KGB in the 1930s, was another good story. I've given the book an unusual structure. It has 60 quite short chapters rather than what I used to do. I tended to write books with 6 chapters, all rather long. I decided I would split them up and allow the reader to even skip around. If you're interested in social networks in ancient Rome, I've got a network for you, the network that spread Christianity through the Roman Empire. If you'd rather focus on the recent past, then we can talk about how networks played their decisive role in the 2016 election. I think it's important to recognize that mostly history underplays the role of social networks. Historians tend to write about states and the people who run states. And that's because states have archives, and it's easy to go to the archive and you tell the story of the people whose papers are in the archive. Secret societies aren't like that. Surprisingly, there is no mafia archive that you can go and consult. And the Illuminati were kind of secretive too, so that it takes a while to put together the documentary record of their activities. And that's a big problem in history as a discipline. We tend to gravitate towards the hierarchies and neglect the social networks.
Niall Ferguson's latest book is The Square and the Tower, Networks and Power, From the Freemasons to Facebook. I'm Ben Domenech. We'll be back with more of the Federalist Radio Hour right after this. And we're back on the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm your host, Ben Domenech. You can email us at radio@thefederalist.com. Follow us on Twitter at FDRLST. And you can follow my guest for the hour today, Niall Ferguson, on Twitter at nfergus. He is an author, academic, and senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. His latest book is The Square and the Tower, Networks and Power, From the Freemasons to Facebook. So you have a chapter in here. You were talking about being able to jump around in your book and pick and choose which chapters to read, and I certainly did that. You have a chapter, The Ring of Five, which talks about the spies during the post-World War II era who had a significant impact and obviously became rather famous in their own right. When you are looking at networks that play out like that, in which it's not just that what they're attempting to do is secretive or, is something that people would rather keep under wraps, but is actually illegal and is meant to be hidden from view and could, result in the deaths of those involved or imprisonment at the least. You obviously have to do more work in order to figure out kind of what's going on and where the connections were made. Talk to us a little bit about the different networks that you studied and that you bring to bear in this book that are in that category, where it's not just that they're doing something that's behind the scenes, but they're doing something that if they were caught doing it, there could be very bad things that could happen to them.
Well, the case of the Cambridge spies illustrates how difficult it can be to uncover a secret network. It took decades to reveal the full extent to which the Russians, the Soviets, as they then were, had penetrated the British establishment, which meant everybody from the diplomatic service through the intelligence service to the keeper of the Queen's art collection, who turned out to be a Soviet spy. The Soviets had been very clever. They had targeted a very elite network, the Cambridge Apostles, which was really the pinnacle of Cambridge University's intellectual life. To get elected to the Apostles was to be the creme de la creme intellectually. In the 1920s, figures like John Maynard Keynes, the economist, were members of the Apostles Society. It was the thing that you wanted to be if you were an intellectually ambitious Englishman. The Soviets realized that if they could get into that network, they would have incredibly valuable assets, because people from the Apostles always ended up in positions of influence. It was a kind of American Express platinum card. You said, I'm in the Apostles, and you were on a fast track to promotion in the British establishment. By recruiting the likes of Guy Burgess, the Soviets therefore were able to get probably the most valuable intelligence assets of the 20th century. I mean, these guys, there were actually more than five, but the five famous ones handed over an immense amount of documentation from British and American sources to the Soviets during and after World War II. And despite making multiple mistakes that ought to have led to their detection, their membership of the elite network in England protected them, and people would cover up for them, partly because they just couldn't believe that these seemingly impeccable Cambridge-educated individuals were Soviet agents. So I think the challenge has been, ever since that time, to accurately reconstruct the story of what happened. And it's only through the effort of historians like Chris Andrew and former Soviet operatives who leaked documents into the public domain, like Mitrokhin, that I can now write this story. And it was fun to write. And we've all heard of the Cambridge spies. I'm sure most of your listeners at least will recognize names like Kim Philby and Guy Burgess. But to show how that network had been created within a network, it's the network within the network that's really crucial here. That I found absolutely fascinating, especially since the consequences were so profound. We don't know how many Allied agents during and after World War II lost their lives because of the Cambridge spies, but it was certainly in the thousands.
Mm-hmm. You have a chapter in here where you have 6 insights which drill down into a couple of understandings of networks. A few of them, I think, will make sense to people. No man is an island, birds of a feather flock together, etc. But then you have one in particular that I wanted to ask you about, and that's your third insight. Weak ties are strong. You write, it also matters how dense a network is, how connected it is to other clusters, even if it is only through a few weak links. Can you give us an example of sort of what you mean when you say that? Because I found that to be something that was interesting and a little provocative in thinking about changing the way that I think about the way that networks behave.
Right. So this really dates back to the work of a Stanford sociologist, Mark Granovetter, who made the point that if we were only connected to our close friends and family, the world would be kind of balkanized. We would all just be in these little clusters of people that we really knew well. Whereas in reality, the clusters of intimate connections are themselves connected via acquaintances. And so, although that acquaintance that you don't know very well, but you know well enough to have a drink with once a year, is not that important to you. The tie is relatively weak compared with your besties. That is actually the connection to a whole other network that you wouldn't otherwise have access to. And Granovetter showed this in a whole variety of ways. There's a big literature on how this helps if you're looking for a job. If you are suddenly rendered unemployed and you start casting around to try to find plan B, it's often those acquaintances, those relatively weak ties that come to your rescue because they connect you to a whole bunch of other opportunities that you didn't give that much attention to, but suddenly turn out to be very valuable. This is also why the world is small. Now, we all know that small world feeling where bizarrely somebody that you know turns up in some remote place where you happen to be traveling, and you think, what a small world it is. But the reason it's a small world is that we have all these relatively weak ties that connect us to much larger circles than we probably really are aware of belonging to. 6 degrees of separation is an old idea. We've all made jokes about it in our time. 6 degrees of Monica Lewinsky, 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. That notion that we are connected, you take 2 random people on the planet, they're connected, and you can get from one to the other by just 6 steps. That's a very important idea that follows from this notion that weak ties are strong, that the acquaintances in your life may turn out to be the ones that connect you to the much larger world, rather than your close friends.
So I want to connect that to something that I think we have been able to observe with more speed and more ability than ever before, thanks to the rise of Twitter and the way that our publicly known media figures use it, and that's basically media groupthink. I remember, that in the past when I was younger, I would get issues of the New Yorker and of other magazines while I was in college, and then afterwards, and there was this delay factor of, well, what does everybody think about this? Well, we'll have to wait and see on Sunday what folks say. And what it took time for groupthink to form. And while there certainly was groupthink and there were fewer barriers, there were higher barriers to entry for competitive media sources, I think we didn't really get the access to see how quickly an idea can really cascade through our press corps in real time. A good example of that sort of thing that happens today with all too much frequency, is that a particular expert, whether they be qualified or not, will weigh in on something that has happened with a particular thought or series of thoughts that will then be shared and retweeted and spread through the galaxy of political media in Washington and in New York with real speed. And it's only after that idea has really taken hold and gotten 14,000 retweets that someone will emerge who objects to it and basically says, actually, this is based on thoroughly wrong information, or this person is thoroughly wrong, and here's why they're wrong. And that follow-up piece will come in the form of an article that will get 100 retweets. And that's something that I see happen almost every week, and it's certainly not just true of politics, but it seems to be particularly true there at the moment. When you are looking at networks like that, where these journalists who may socialize together but may also only know each other via Twitter, that type of speed is something that I feel we didn't have the ability to witness before. Has it always been the case, just sort of restricted by technology and communication ability? Or do you see throughout history these types of things happen over and over again?
I think one shouldn't exaggerate how new the world is, because if one looks at the history of newspapers in their heyday, one can see similar phenomena. I've been thinking a lot about William Randolph Hearst, who probably was the most powerful publisher of content before Mark Zuckerberg's rise. And, you could see some of the pathologies of our time. If you look back to Hearst's heyday in the early 20th century, fake news certainly proliferated through Hearst's titles, and although he didn't have as large a market share of news consumption as Facebook now has, he had enough to make a difference on a bunch of important political issues. Groupthink amongst journalists is certainly nothing new. The tendency of the media to hunt in two packs, a liberal pack and a conservative pack. That's certainly something that existed. And if you don't believe me, go do some work on the late 1960s and early 1970s. It wasn't so very different. But I think the speed and scale of the online network platforms has really had an impact. And it's very striking the way in which a fake story can go viral and the rebuttal can simply be invisible. So I think we are as we were before, but more so. The Pope endorses Donald Trump was a fake news story from 2016 that got a huge amount of traction. The correction, actually, Pope doesn't endorse Donald Trump, funnily enough, not so much. And I think we've seen something kind of similar with the frenzy around Michael Wolff's book, Fire and Fury, which, you know, most journalists, certainly those who cover Washington, were critical of because they didn't regard Wolff as a real pro-Washington hack, but they didn't stop writing about it, and they still haven't stopped writing about it. And even the things that weren't in the book but were just hinted at are making news, to the extent that I think our impression of the Trump White House has now indelibly been skewed by Wolff's portrayal. It's going to be very difficult for any author to come along and correct that. And if you ever do try and offer some corrective, I did this the other day by saying, you know what, actually the Clinton White House in its first year was a bit like that too.
Yes.
I was sort of howled down for, quote, normalizing Trump. So this sense that one can get howled down by a really kind of pretty well organized pack of critical writers is I think it's novel. I think looking back on my early career, because I'm old enough now to have written and published books and articles long before the internet was really a variable in our lives, I don't remember the same sense of unease or disquiet that one now gets. You publish something and you kind of brace yourself for the onslaught. In the old days, you would publish something and it might be quite controversial. The worst you had to face was a bunch of letters in green ink that would arrive about a week later. And I think that's the really interesting phenomenon, the way in which stories can not only be circulated very rapidly by a well coordinated, like-minded crowd, they can also be destroyed. Mm-hmm. And so if you get on the wrong side of the pack, then you can find your story discredited, but you discredit it because very quickly the targets, the attacks become ad hominem.
And of course your position there regarding the first year is utterly accurate in the sense that you had multiple different nominees that had to be withdrawn. You had a special counsel. You had a replacement for the press secretary. You had all sorts of different upheaval within the Clinton White House in their first year. But as that is before YouTube, it is no longer something that is relevant to any of the current discussion, and so everyone can disagree with you.
And of course, there's a substantial contingent of people commenting and writing on politics who are so young they have absolutely no recollection of how that first Clinton year was.
Exactly.
I actually went back and read Bob Woodward's book, The Agenda, which covers year one of the Clinton presidency. I was amazed at the resemblances. The president losing his temper and shooting his mouth. The family, in the case of the Clinton White House, it was his wife getting far too involved in policy, healthcare getting messed up, a tax bill finally getting through the House after much nail-biting working of the phones, and constant complaints about negative press coverage. So if you want to remind yourself that the White House is what it is, pretty much regardless of the personalities involved, reread Woodward's The Agenda. Just change the name.
Yes.
It's the same story as Michael Wolff, maybe just a little less overdone.
Yes. You obviously started this conversation by saying that you thought about writing this book while you were writing your book about Henry Kissinger. Tell me a little bit about Kissinger and the way that he kind of ran his network in particular.
To me, this is an interesting test case of a hypothesis. I thought it would be fun to try to graph Henry Kissinger's network, and the way that I did it with some help from a very bright young social networks guy named Manny Rincon, was to take every single book written by anybody who was in either the Nixon or Ford administrations, and that right down to the lowliest memoir writer, and see who name checks whom, essentially, who mentions whom, who shows up most frequently in those volumes when you put them all together and graph the network. So the network of the Nixon Ford administrations, not surprisingly, but it was nice to have it confirmed, shows that Kissinger, after Nixon, was the second most important person by any meaningful measure. He's certainly the most connected, but he's also the most connecting. In other words, if you want to get to someone else in the network, you often have to go through Kissinger. So that, I think, strongly suggests that networks are an important tool, and network analysis is an important tool of understanding politics, because it lets you get at the structure of relationships within a government. The next step, which will happen in volume 2 of the biography, is looking at how his network extended beyond the realm of government into the media, for example, even into Hollywood, and then, of course, to all kinds of foreign governments. And that's, I think, a really important part of the story. You can't explain Kissinger's rise to tremendous influence and power by the mid-1970s purely in terms of his remarkable intellect and drive. Those were certainly important, but it's not a sufficient explanation for why he really becomes second only to Nixon. To explain that, I think you have to look at his ability to build a network which was really second to none.
Do we have someone today who has that type of importance and relevance? I mean, it seems like with the rise of this populist wave and the shift that we've seen within the White House and the way that this government works, that one of the things that's lacking is kind of an appreciation for the theorist practitioner type, someone like Kissinger who has that type of network that they can lean on. One could argue that under the Bush White House, that was Dick Cheney, or you could make an argument for a number of other sort of individuals. Do you think that type of important theorist practitioner exists today? And if so, who are they?
Well, I think that they exist, or at least they aspire to exist, if one graphs the Trump network on the basis of Wolf's book, unreliable though that may be as evidence, then in that book, which covers really the first 7 months, roughly, of the administration, there were two centers of power: Steve Bannon, who now, of course, is gone, and Jared and Ivanka. And I think the key question is, with Bannon gone, is that where power now resides, with the president's daughter and son-in-law, or has John Kelly, since becoming chief of staff, changed the architecture of power? And is the Trump administration going to slowly normalize? Now, what typically happens in a presidency, certainly it's what happened in Bill Clinton's case, is that the people who were important in the campaign eventually get put aside because they turn out not to have the necessary skills for government, and you bring in the professionals. That happened when George Stephanopoulos was kind of downgraded and David Gergen was brought on board to stabilize communications out of the Clinton White House. I think some similar process is underway in the Trump White House since Steve Bannon's exit, and that John Kelly's the key figure who's imposing some kind of standard operating procedure on the way the White House works. And that is going over time to contain the president's somewhat erratic personality. Of course, I could be proved wrong in half an hour if he turned around and fired Kelly. The great thing about covering the Trump White House is you never know what's coming next, but you should certainly never assume a quiet news day. So that's the kind of dynamic that interests me, because it gets us away from constantly talking about the president's personality, which is a full-time job for some people. I would rather we focused on the structure of politics, and network analysis helps you to do that because it allows you to see in any administration who are the power brokers, who are the central nodes in the network, because once you know that, you understand that power is not just in the hands of the president. This is not a monarchy. It's designed to be a separation of powers, but even within the White House itself, power must necessarily be subdivided between the president and those who advise him and manage access to him.
Niall Ferguson's latest book is The Square and the Tower, Networks and Power from the Freemasons to Facebook. I'm Ben Domenech. We'll be back with more of the Federalist Radio Hour right after this. And we're back on the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm your host, Ben Domenech. You can email us at radio@thefederalist.com and follow us on Twitter at FDRLST. We're brought to you by Podcast One, and we're coming to you from Hillsdale College's Kirby Center in Washington, D.C., where my guest for the hour today is Niall Ferguson, whose latest book is The Square and the Tower, Networks and Power from the Freemasons to Facebook. You can follow him on Twitter at nfergus. So you are from Scotland originally?
I was born and raised there in Glasgow, yeah.
Yeah, I'm going there for the first time in the next couple of months and looking forward to it. Are you an American?
Pack an umbrella.
Are you an American citizen now?
I'm not yet. I'm waiting patiently for the test, but I'm teetering on the brink of citizenship unless I flunk the test.
Well, I'm sure that you don't have to worry too much about that. You have written, a great deal about a number of different topics, but one of the running things that crops up in your work quite a lot is sort of a critique of Europe and its understanding of itself. Obviously, this is something that has been a topic on the minds of a lot of people, given both the migrant crisis, Brexit, situation in Catalonia, that type of thing. I wonder a little bit about what your reflection is now, kind of at a remove from Europe and not being quite as close to it. How do you perceive the direction that it's going and sort of its understanding of itself in this particular populist moment?
I certainly think that the European Union is a worthy case for study within this framework of networks and hierarchies, because it has its origins as an enterprise back in the 1950s, when hierarchical governmental structures were really riding high. In the post-Second World War period, social networks were pretty unimportant, and the great states and empires that had fought World War II seemed to bestride the globe. I think the European project, as it's evolved, has remained very much the product of intergovernmental negotiation and design. And if you go to Brussels, you realize that it is essentially a bureaucracy atop the bureaucracies. So the national government's bureaucracies essentially meet and deal with a European bureaucracy in Brussels. This is a pretty hierarchical structure, and it comes up with the classic ideas of the mid-20th century, such as, let's all have the same monetary system. Let's have a monetary union. This is an idea that really got going in the 1970s, but didn't get done until the late 90s and early 2000s. And some of us at the time said, look, this is a really bad idea, because if you create a single monetary system for these very disparate economies, at some point something bad is going to happen, because this one-size-fits-all monetary regime just won't work. And sure enough, the monetary union, in my view, made the financial crisis much worse in Europe than it needed to be. And if there hadn't been monetary union, I think the financial crisis would have had much less impact on Southern Europe. They would probably almost certainly have had to devalue their currencies, but the effects on output and employment would have been much less damaging than they were. So I'd say the problem with European integration remains that it is a fundamentally mid-20th century project of top-down governance, in which bureaucracies and the elites who are employed by them design European-wide projects and then essentially impose them on ordinary people. And the trouble is that ordinary people now have tools of organization that they didn't have before, and online social networks are amongst those tools. So Brexit was, for me, an educational experience, witnessing the ways in which the Leave campaign used social media to convey their message and mobilize people in the provinces of England and Wales against Europe. That was very instructive, because I think the elites were completely taken by surprise. People in London and Brussels and Paris and Berlin completely underestimated the probability of Brexit. And I think unless you spent time either online or in the provinces, you didn't see just how strong the revulsion against the European bureaucracy was. I don't think this story's over. Brexit, of course, like any divorce, is taking longer and costing more than people expected. But I do think that when you look at sentiment in other countries, even although the political system makes it hard for populists to come to power, they're certainly in power in Poland. They're certainly in power in Hungary. They came closer than expected in the Netherlands, where Geert Wilders, though he's not able to form a government, now leads the largest party in the Dutch parliament. And I don't see much sign that European elites have learned their lesson. Emmanuel Macron, the French president, is a kind of charismatic, youthful, dynamic leader, but his basic project is the old European Franco-German project of creating a European superstate. And I think at some point the guilt will come off, and we'll see that French populist impatience with this kind of project was not killed off in 2017.
Mm-hmm. You have a very unique role, which is and people can see you doing it if they look up your various appearances on YouTube, which is that you are one of those people who is welcome at the parties of all of these elite networks. You are allowed in the building and frequently on stage, and then you tell them that pretty much everything that they believe is bollocks. So here's my question for you: How do you manage to do that, to kind of offer a contrarian, corrective view, in your view, up to the assumptions of elites in ways that can actually have an impact? How do you force them to listen to your idea and not just dismiss it as being something that's needlessly contrarian or baseless simply because every article that they read, or 90% of them in the New York Times, are going to disagree with you?
My answer to that would be you win some, you lose some. I mean, I think there's a constant battle to try to get conventional wisdom to change. Mm-hmm. But you can't always move people. I'll give an example. More than a decade ago, I wrote a book called Empire, about the history of the British Empire, which attempted to show that there were benefits as well as costs to the period of British dominance of a large part of the globe. And I think it was ultimately impossible to make certainly academic left-leaning opinion move on that issue, because it is almost an article of religious faith that no good whatsoever could possibly have come from empire, and to contemplate the possibility of a balance sheet with benefits as well as costs is to commit a kind of heresy. Now, I'm always reminded of that Monty Python sequence in The Life of Brian, when John Cleese asks, "What do the Romans ever do for us?" and the whole series of answers to that question then follow, like aqueducts, roads, apart from the aqueducts. But you can't actually have a reasoned discussion about the British Empire on an American university or British university campus anymore. Despite the fact that I did my level best to deploy compelling economic historical data to show that, for example, the British Empire promoted investment in infrastructure in the course of the 19th and early 20th century, improved public health in colonies. There is a certain class of person who does not want to hear the data, never mind the argument. At other times, I think I've been more successful. I think I had a reasonable run explaining to people in Wall Street that history applied to them, and that financial crises weren't about to be abolished by the Federal Reserve. That was back in the pre-2008 period, and events duly came to my assistance by proving the point when Lehman Brothers blew up and the financial system came close to collapse. So I plug away in a, I hope, serious and sincere effort to challenge received wisdom when it seems at odds with historical evidence. And I think the historian's role should be to do that. You should constantly be saying to people, you think it's unprecedented, but it's not, and here's why it's not, and here's the evidence that it's not. And I think there's a similar argument to be made about the Trump administration. A lot of people a year ago were predicting American tyranny and the rapid collapse of the republic, et cetera, et cetera. And I said this is silly because this is American populism, and we've seen this before, and the system is resilient and was designed to be resilient in the face of populism. I think that argument will be won, but even now, I don't think it's even halfway won, because there's a tremendously strong confirmation bias amongst left-leaning liberals. They will simply screen out evidence that the constitutional order is working and seek evidence to confirm the thesis that Trump is a tyrant and the republic is on its last legs.
You know, so much of this to me and so much of this moment seems to be explained by looking at the experience of the baby boomers, coming from an era that is very different from the one we live in now, in which you have large trusted institutions, in which so many different institutions of American life, had significant trust from the population, and that we now exist in an era in which there is very little trust for those institutions, in not just, of course, our political ones, such as the Congress, but also just the institutions of public life, everything, from the church to Major League Baseball to, anything else like that. And it seems to me that that's very much the story of why, baby boomers would turn in such a significant way to a figure like Trump and to what he represented as a corrective, as an attempt to correct what they see as going wrong with the country. The problem is, as you outline in your book, we've seen the decay of so many of these institutions, including our bureaucracy, including our parties, including the administrative state itself, that it turns out to not be very good at its job, whether that's, whether that's the kind of attempt that was made in Iraq under President Bush, or whether that's domestically at home responding to disasters, or even launching a healthcare website. This is the sort of thing where people just don't trust these institutions to deliver on their promise. And that to me seems to be an indication that the networks that have been underlying these institutions have themselves weakened. Can they be restored in a way that doesn't end up just seizing more power away from the people? Can they be built up to the point where these institutions can deliver on their promise or become healthier in American life?
I think that there's a close relationship between the decline in trust in established institutions and the rise of movements that rely on online social networks for their strength. I don't think one would have got to the Trump moment if there hadn't been a very high level of disillusionment with the political establishment, which Hillary Clinton seemed to personify for many people. So it's important to recognize that networked disruptions are much more likely to succeed where the hierarchy is sclerotic, seems corrupt, and has lost public confidence. I think one of the important parts of the book is a reflection on the administrative state and its increasingly dysfunctional quality, which I think you can trace back all the way to the 1970s. As the executive branch has grown and as its capacity for generating regulation has grown, I think there's been a growing alienation of ordinary citizens from that administrative state. The typical American today is conflicted, at least to judge by opinion polling, that there is, on the one hand, a frustration with the institutions of government, especially with Congress, but there's also, and I find this disturbing, a kind of readiness to welcome state intervention, which is in marked contrast to attitudes back in the 1980s when Ronald Reagan's statement that government was the problem had wide resonance. So I think part of our contemporary pathology is that we're disillusioned with the institutions, but we kind of want the government to fix our problems. Tocqueville would be appalled if Tocqueville were to come back, the author of Democracy in America, the man who celebrated the ability of ordinary Americans to solve their own problems with voluntary associations, with local networks, rather than by appealing to central government. If Tocqueville came back and traveled through this modern United States, he would conclude that the French must at some point have taken over America and turned Americans into Frenchmen, because we've got the attitude that Tocqueville complained about back in the 19th century, the French attitude of, I wish the government would fix this, all over America today. And for somebody who's been a long-time critic of the large administrative state with its centralizing, bureaucratizing tendencies, I'm worried that we've lost our connection to that old American virtue, the virtue to solve problems through local networks rather than by appealing to central government.
Mm-hmm. I am concerned about that as well, of course, and this is the irony that you're talking about, that we lose trust in the government, and then we appeal to the government to seize more power in order to solve the problem that they bungled in the first place.
Yeah.
Just speaking as someone who lives here and who has this on his mind, have you found yourself sort of thinking more deliberately about the subject of neighborhood? Essentially, just what can I do in my own life that would represent solving a problem via a local network, as opposed to appealing or to making some kind of assumption about someone else fixing that problem for me?
Absolutely. I found myself sitting with a group of my neighbors just a couple of weekends ago, making provision for the eventuality of a major earthquake. If you live in Northern California, you'd be crazy not to think about that. And it was almost liberating to be told that in the event of a major earthquake, our neighborhood would effectively be on its own for potentially weeks. So we have been working together, thinking about how we will or would cope in that eventuality. And it brought the neighborhood together, helped us all get to know one another better. And I said at the end of the meeting, I really hope there's never an earthquake, but I'm really glad that we've done this, because even if there's no earthquake, we've shown that we actually are capable of dealing with our own problems and doing it as a community without needing to call on the powers that be. I'm a passionate believer in that kind of local organization. Activism is a word I'm wary of. We don't need to be political when we do these things, and I'm absolutely sure as a group we covered the full spectrum of political views when we met, but that was irrelevant, because the problems of what you would do in an earthquake are not political. I had a similar experience in the UK, where I still spend time because I have family there, dealing with the problem of pollution on the beach, the plastic bottles and the beach problem. Anybody who lives near a beach will know that the ocean pollution is on the rise, and you can walk along your beautiful shoreline and spend all day picking up plastic bottles. So in frustration, I mobilized the local neighborhood in the place where I spend time in the UK in South Wales, and we decided we'd make that beach clean because nobody else was going to do it. And again, it was a very fulfilling effort to just deal with the problem ourselves without needing to politicize it or call in outside help. And I do think that what we need as a society, as a country, is a return to that approach for as much as we possibly can. As many problems as possible need to be solved in that way. And trust me, online social networks may be able to help with that, but they will only be able to help if there is a real social network of neighbors, of the community that operates regardless of technology, that gets together in somebody's home and spends a few hours, even if it's only a few times a year, saying what are the problems and how can we deal with them.
Niall Ferguson's latest book is The Square and the Tower, Networks and Power from the Freemasons to Facebook. You can follow him on Twitter @nfergus. Thanks so much for spending so much time with us today, sir.
It's been my pleasure. Great conversation.
I'm Ben Domenech. You've been listening to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. We'll be back tomorrow with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.